So hi everyone, welcome to Core Competency session today. Michelle and I are going to be giving you an overview of our funding sources here in the Department of Medicine. So I'm Melina, I'm Melina Montblanc. I'm the derm administrator. I've been administrator in dermatology for the past 5 years, but I've had a total of 9 years here at the UW. I started off as the UWP practice advisor for the Department of Medicine. And then I moved into the administrator role for the Harborview Service Chief shortly thereafter. My education is I have a bachelor's in biology and I've earned my master's in health systems administration. And then I'll let Michelle introduce herself.
All right. Hi, I'm Michelle Lynch. I'm the administrator for general internal medicine. I've been in this position for 10 years and at the university for 20, spending time prior to medicine on upper campus in planning and budgeting and in various administrative roles. And before I came to the university, I worked for Group Health, where I also did financial and administrative work and managed the fee schedule for a while. I did my education at the UW. I got a bachelor's degree and a master's of public administration. And I was one of those perpetual part-time non-traditional students who slowly slogged my way through that.
All right, great. So let's dive in. So this is one perspective of how you can view the University of Washington and all the different entities that of all the different entities that the UW encompasses. So we are under the School of Medicine, but the School of Medicine is also straddles the UW medicine side, which is mostly the clinical side, and then the Health Services Administration, which is the teaching and research. There's 12 colleges in the University of Washington, ranging from School of Law, School of Business, and then School of Medicine. The School of Medicine has 31 additional departments that are Department of OBGYN, ophthalmology, pathology, and of course, Department of Medicine is one of the largest departments in the School of Medicine. This is another perspective on how to view us. And I'll just, as I said before, in the University of Washington, that's the academic schools. In the School of Medicine, it houses our medical students, so all of their education happens. The School of Medicine also has clinical components, which are clinical departments such as medicine, surgery, pediatrics, etc., and also non-clinical departments like microbiology, immunology, and medical ethics. There's also an administrative component to the school, and that's your GME, Graduate Medical Education. I'm sorry if I'm going to say a lot of acronyms. Please stop or type in the chat if you don't know a certain acronym. I'm going to try and spell it out, but if I fail to do so, please just type it in and I'll let you know what that is. And also regulatory affairs happen in the school. The Department of Medicine, we have residency programs that reside in the department. And as I said before, we have 13 individual divisions. A lot of interactions happen between the department and the divisions, and certain divisions have fellowship program and postdoc programs that are run by the individual divisions. A lot of this interaction between the divisions and the departments, it ranges from research administration, space, facilities, business, and just strategic planning, and also academic, staff, HR, and finance. So again, another look and deeper dive into the department. Our chair is Dr. Barbara Young. Said before, we have a medical student program and a residency program in the department. 13 divisions. Each of those divisions have a division head and a division administrator. We have 3 vice chairs at the hospitals, UWMC, Harborview, and VA. We have associate chairs for research, DEI, patient care, and finance and administration. And the central engine of the Department of Medicine is in this DOM Central Administrative Group. And that they handle everything from academic HR, staff HR, clinical practice and business planning, as well as finance is housed in this central administrative group. So there's a lot of lingo that's thrown out when we speak of finance in the department. Some of these are PSA, shortfall, R&T allocations, and we'll go through some of these as we progress in our presentation today. So we have a tripartite mission here at the Department of Medicine. They consist of patient care, research, and education. The patient care is our inpatient and outpatient care in UW Medicine Health Systems. Research consists of basic, clinical, and translational research. And a lot of our teaching happens primarily in the hospital, but can also occur in the clinical and the lab settings. So how is all this funded? We have to have some sort of money to run this successful program. So funding for patient care primarily comes from our patients, either coming into the hospital or being in one of our clinics, insurance providers, and government payers such as Medicare and Medicaid all fund the clinical aspect of our mission. Research is funded through private and public sponsor awards. So these are people like the NIH, the DoD, and there's also different foundations that also sponsor research. Our education mission is funded through the state of Washington and other sources that pay for our teaching activities. And then there's also another part of funding, which is we consider the other category, and that's gift and endowments. And we'll go deeper into the difference between gifts and endowments further along in the presentation. But these are funds that are given to the university through private donors or foundations, and they can only be used for what the donor intended them to be used for. So again, the mission, 3 parts, but they're not equally funded. A lot of it is funded by patient care, which compromises 40% of our funding, followed by research at 31%, and the other smaller portions are state funds, gifts and endowments, and other funds. So again, patient care, we have hospital agreements and then patient care revenue that comes in from our clinical activities. And these monies are used to pay the clinical salaries of our faculty and also institutional overhead. Lights, water, things like that, just to keep the buildings up and running. A small portion of that is allocated into our R&T budget. R&T stands for research and training. And that small amount of money is used for division operating funds and department operating funds. Grants and contract awards, those funds are used for direct research and also institutional overhead. There's a small portion of the funds that we receive from our government and foundational sponsors, and those taxes, quote unquote taxes, go into an RCR budget, research cost recovery budget, and those also help to fund the operating budgets for the department and the division. The education piece, the monies that we receive from other sources and the state, those funds go to pay the program directors and the faculty who are involved in our teaching activities. And a small portion of that is also allocated towards the operating funds of the division and the department. Our gifts and endowments, as I mentioned before, these are specific funds for a specific activity, and those cannot be used for anything other than what the donor has specified. We also have this really small valve of unrestricted gifts and endowments, and we use that for a discretionary account. And the most common thing that those are used for, but it could be used for other things, is our alcohol purchases. Again, this is just showing it with the buckets. The majority of our funding comes from patient care and research, while the small amount, the pennies, come in for our discretionary account spending. So there's two types of revenue that we get from the clinical realm. There's two types of bills that go out. There's the hospital bill, which the hospital bills and retains all of those monies that are received from that bill. And that is used to cover facility fees, hospital staff, any equipment or supplies that are used during that hospital visit. And then our providers, our doctors, our APPs, which are advanced practice practitioners, which are APPs and our PAs, their bills are billed by UBP, which is our practice plan. They send out a bill, and those fees are used to pay the providers' salaries and also overhead. So you're going to ask, well, you heard the term PSA, which stands for Physician Services Agreement. So how does that turn into actual money? Each department and division negotiate a PSA rate. So for this example, I just used a PSA rate of $70 per work RVUs. And this example shows you how work RVUs converts into dollars. So for Division A, for 1 year, let's just say they produced and generated 10,000 RVUs. That equates to $700,000 of funding that comes into the division. But you look down and you see faculty salaries are $680,000. So that has to be covered first from that money generated from the clinical income. And what remains, excuse me, is $20,000. And that's could be used for division and also department operating funds. And Michelle.
All right, thanks, Melina. So that's obviously a big chunk of funding for the department, and another significant source is the research funding. Now, most research costs fall under either what we call direct cost or indirect cost. So the direct costs are those costs which are the direct cost of conducting a research activity. So the PI time, any staff that are on that research, supplies, et cetera. Indirect costs are the overhead costs that support the overall research program at the university. And you may hear the term F&A, which stands for Facilities and Administrative Rates. And that's the rate the university charges to our outside sponsors in order to have the funds to cover those things such as custodial services and central HR, et cetera. Sometimes you might hear this referred to as overhead or indirect cost recovery. Next slide, please. So yes, as I said, sometimes people refer to this as indirect cost recovery. Another thing to think about is that F&A rate also varies depending on what location that research is taking place at. So for on campus, which is the majority of the Seattle campus, it's a 55.5% rate. If you go down to the third line, you see that South Lake Union is a 76.5% rate. So we've had a significant higher expenses at South Lake Union, building new buildings, bench labs, et cetera. So they do charge a higher rate of funding. Next slide, please. So you may wonder, and I know PIs ask this all the time, what happens to that overhead rate, those funds that we're charging to the grants? Why don't I get to use that for my research? Well, here's an example of a grant that has $100,000 of direct costs. It's located at SLU, so it has an F&A rate of 76.5%. So the grant that's being submitted to the sponsor, whether it's NIH or a private foundation, is going to actually ask for $176,500. $100,000 to go to the PI to support all the costs related to the research that person's doing, and then $76,500 to support this ICR. So again, who gets that $76,500? Does it come back to the department or the division? Next slide, please. No, unfortunately not. So as you can imagine, it costs a lot to run a large university. So of that ICR that comes back, $76,500. The university charges about 65%, and that goes to cover custodial services, electricity, buildings, all of those things. So we don't normally pay rent and that sort of thing. That's just charged to the university essentially. It also covers things like the Office of Sponsor Programs and the GCA and those departments that help us manage our grants. So once you take that figure out, you're left with this adjusted balance of $26,775. Again, does that come back? The PI wants to know, do I get to use that for my research? Unfortunately, no, because there's other overhead costs that need to be covered. So the School of Medicine then takes their share, about 86 to 87%. And as you can see, that leaves a very small pot of money for the department and the division. And then that money is shared between the department and the division. And when it gets to that point, we call that RCR, which is Research Cost Recovery. So each division will have an RCR budget. And then those expenses are expected to cover the salaries of the staff that do the pre and post award work. It also covers, should cover, hopefully in an ideal world, the any faculty salary cap if we're not allowed to charge the faculty's full salary to the research grant. It should also cover any grant writing time for that faculty member. As you can imagine, it rarely does. And you can see that little tax drip over there from the faucet. But we do get some of those funds back, like I said. On average, it's about 2%, and that's because different grants have different overhead rates, and they have some grants actually don't allow us to charge our full university FNA rate. But I won't get into that details. You're welcome to ask any research administrator at any time. I'm sure they'd be happy to kind of fill you in on those nuances. Next slide. So just to recap, you will probably often hear these terms, FNA, ICR, RCR, and they're really all related to the same concept of overhead. So there's the direct cost of research, which we then charge the FNA rate against. We calculate that and we charge it to the sponsor. What we return is the indirect cost recovery. The UW then takes their overhead out of it. School of Medicine takes their overhead. And then what's remaining is this RCR, or research cost recovery, that goes into our allocation to help us fund operations of our division. Next slide. So the other source of funding, obviously we are a medical school. We are funding students in education. And so, but the thing about a clinical department is most of our teaching actually occurs in the clinical setting or possibly in the research setting. We do have a medical school and many of our faculty teach in that medical school. And another nuance to the University of Washington's medical school is that we are a regional medical school, and we cover we also provide education to students from Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, and Idaho. So you might hear the phrase whammy. And if you attended the Road to the White Coat presentation in a prior session, you've heard this term whammy before. So these are funds that help us educate students to become medical doctors. And then, of course, we also have residencies and fellowships, as Melina mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. Some of the funds do come directly from Washington State, and we refer to those as state allocations. These are also in our state budgets, for those of you that are familiar with the different types of budgets we have, and also could be known as general operating funds, or GOF. These state funds help pay our faculty salaries. So like I said, some of our faculty actually have teaching roles in the college, or they have a title called college faculty. They might be a course director. And then next slide, please. We also have, whoops, back up one.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So we get the state funds, and we also get funds from these other states that are helping to support this regional medical school: Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, and Idaho. So in addition to our state or GOF budgets, some divisions may also receive a whammy allocation. And like I said, that goes to help support faculty salaries primarily, for those who have large leadership or teaching roles. So for example, in GIM, we have an associate chief of medicine at Harborview, John Sheffield, who's partially funded on these whammy funds. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Next slide, please. All right, so other sources of education funds, because like we mentioned, we have our residency and fellowship programs. We do get funding from the hospitals, which we refer to as single source funding, and that helps pay the salaries of residents who are working in a clinical setting. We have research that might sponsor fellowships. So for example, you might have heard the term T32, which is a grant to support that. And then sometimes donors actually provide funds to help support the education mission. It's not all about teaching necessarily medical students, residents, and fellows. So for example, we have a faculty member in GIM, Brock Gaster, who has some funding from a donor to help support dementia education for other primary care providers. So that could, teaching could expand beyond the traditional student relationship that you might think of. Next slide. So as you've seen before, these faucets have kind of the big faucet of what the majority of the funding goes through. Small portions of it come back to help us fund operations. Next. And then the last source is this gifts and endowments. So we have gifts, and the reason we separate the gifts and endowments is typically a gift is a balance that can be funded or expended entirely. So if we get, say, $5,000 to support a specific program, we spend the money. Once the money's used up, it's gone. We've used it all up. These are, like Melina said, they have a very specific purpose, and we have an Office of Advancement who helps us raise those funds. Next slide, please. The other major source is endowments. So these are also gift funds, but what happens with an endowment is the principal remains intact, and we only spend off of the income generated from that investment. So this will fluctuate based on the market performance. Next slide, please. So that 100,000 principal endowment will never be spent. That is what is invested. And so say that earns a 10,000 K on the market. About 4% comes back to the divisions to help support funds related to that endowment. And then anything extra remains in the principal as an investment. If you really want to nerd out on this, I actually had some time yesterday where I spent looking at the Consolidated Endowment Fund report. I provided a link at the bottom that gives you a little bit more information about that. On average, we've had about a 6% return on investment, but as you know, markets fluctuate. And so in order to be conservative, only a portion of that is returned to the division for expenses. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the principal is protected. So all of these various buckets of money come back and we get portions of it. We kind of siphon off a little bit of it in order to support the division and department expenses. So we have our R&T that comes out of clinical, we have the RCR that comes from research, we've got our state funds and our gift funds. Well, what do we do with that operations? What does that mean to fund our operations? Well, that basically funds salaries, probably of everyone on this call. Any IT needs, computers, office supplies. Sometimes we have to do some space remodels. It funds if we're doing mailings, or, you know, at one point we will probably be able to travel again and it will fund travel. Sometimes there's shortfall in other areas. I had talked about RCR being able to cover any faculty salary caps. So if a grant won't allow us to charge the full faculty salary, we have to somehow cover that. Sometimes that has to come out of your operations. You might have to bridge someone. The grant hasn't been funded and we need to kind of bridge some salaries until a new grant is submitted and received. So these are all things that need to come out of those various pots of operations funding. So as you can see with the next slide, we have to be incredibly efficient. There's a lot of things that need to come out of these sources of funds, and there's not always enough. So we sometimes kind of have to ration our operations. Next slide, please. So all of these are the sources of funding that help us then provide patient care, support research, support education here in the Department of Medicine. And yeah, that's what we're here for. That's what you're here for. And if you have any questions, we are open to them.
You have questions you want to add to the chat, you can do that, or you can just speak up, because I don't exactly see so many hands going up in the air at the same time that there will be too much competition. That was a pretty high level overview. Thanks, Michelle and Melina, for putting that together. We have talked about this not for several years in prior core competencies. You know, there's not to downplay, because this was very high level, but there is a lot of juggling that goes on between different sources. And one of the things that I just wanted to highlight is that quite often people hear about all these great gift announcements or endowment announcements, and it does make it seem like we're richer than we are at times, because one of the things I don't think you really got into too much is the restrictions that go
Right.
on gifts. It's not like a personal birthday gift where you get to decide what to do with it. You get to do whatever the donor decides you want to do with it. And so that can be really challenging at times, I know, as an administrator, to feel like there's this pot of money you just can't touch unless the right person comes along and they want to do that kind of work.
Exactly. All right. I think I saw a question from Rob about the RCR return rate for industry sponsors, and no, actually the overhead rate we charge industry sponsors often can vary and may not be as high as our F&A rate for the university. So those rates do vary depending on the sponsor.
So there is a question. Yeah, Chrissy added a chat question. Can you help explain?
And then Chrissy had a question about how PIs can use gift funding to help pay salaries if they are required to be used as the donor specifies. So for example, we have in my division a faculty member who does research in a blood disease called neutropenia. He is able to use that gift funding to support his research. So, if he, maybe doesn't have enough grant funding or he's in between grants, et cetera, he can then use that gift funding to pay, whether it's his own salary or the salary of the staff that work on his research in the lab, he can pay them from those gift funding, but it has to be related to his neutropenia research.
I have a question about, this might fall under the clinical revenue, but can you explain the difference between DPA and DHF? Like, when we fill out the RFAs, we have to include the percentage of each.
Yeah, DHF stands for direct hospital funding. And these are agreements that are negotiated between the department and the hospital. And DHF usually covers, like, let's just say, it's mostly at Harborview. So if a provider has one clinic, they are supported on a hospital budget for 10% of their salary support. The DPA stands for, and I'm going to get this wrong because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I don't even know what it stands for. Monica, Michelle, you guys know.
I was actually thinking, hey, tell me what it stands for after all these years.
It doesn't make any sense. So it's just basically the budget that we put all our faculty salaries on that generate RVUs in the PSA, the Physician Services Agreement. There's all these different sorts of agreements that you kind of piece together here at the UW, but primarily the DPA is used for those clinics that generate RVUs that are paid via the PSA model. And the DHF is, I'm trying not to get too specific. That's my downfall. I try to go down a rabbit hole, but those agreements that are pre-negotiated for specific clinics at primarily Harborview are on DHF agreements.
So Lisa Billings and Zarina Francisco quickly jumped in to say DPA stands for Department of Public Assistance.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Which is kind of a misnomer because those funds are actually a result of the clinical income that's generated. So kind of interesting that it's called public assistance when in the reality.
It's a historical name. It came from
Yeah.
a long time ago and they just never changed it.
I've always thought of it as direct payroll agreements or something, but hey, good to know. Maybe I should save this chat for the future.
I guess whatever helps make you remember it.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I had a question about RVUs since they seem to control so much about like the money aspect of what happens. So is that specific to like each division, how much RVUs are worth? And is this system like specific to UW, or like do all universities that have like clinical things going on also have RVUs?
Yeah, so RVU stands for relative value unit. And this is it depends on, there's different levels of billing that occurs. And this is nationwide, and it's set by the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services. So for like, there's, 99213 or something. And I'm just totally making this up because I don't remember off the top of my head what individual RVUs are valued at, but that could be valued at 1.5. So it depends on how many times that 99213 is billed through our physician services. We get that cumulative values of RVUs. And then the, excuse me, the system turns that into money based on this negotiated PSA rate. And the PSA rate for our institution, it varies for departments. So medicine has a PSA rate, surgery has a different PSA rate. It all depends on, the negotiation at the school level.
Melina, is it okay if I jump in here and just
Yeah.
back that up a little bit? So, so Danielle, pretend you're going to the doctor. So you're going to the doctor, and sometimes you have a less complex issue to discuss with your doctor, and sometimes you have a more complex issue to discuss with your doctor. And so when the doctor writes up their notes about what was going on in your health and your life, and they talk about how they treated you, that documentation is then essentially associated with a code. So that's what Melina was referring to as the 99123 or something. And there's this whole book of CPT codes, which now I, of course, have to remember what CPT stands for, but it's each code is then associated, it's then translated into work RVUs based on complexity. And then those work RVUs are translated into a dollar rate. So it's this whole rabbit trail of how we get dollars based on the work done. So I'm sure people have been in meetings where they go, well, that doesn't generate any work RVUs. So it's like, it's work that needs to be done because it's care that needs to be provided, but some is considered more worth than others.
And then you also asked if this is how all hospitals or medical schools are funded. And it's not necessarily. Everyone has their own funding agreements. A lot of them do something based on RVUs, but others might have a shortfall agreement where they just know we need to pay for these faculty to do these services, and there's all sorts of funding agreements.
That's a whole other presentation.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I think it was Will, you said had a question about indirect costs, Michelle?
Rob.
Rob. Okay, that what's interesting too is that some sponsors like industry, people will say like, why does industry have a lower indirect cost rate than maybe the federal government? And so a huge part of that is the federal government is usually supporting our labs basically through their indirect cost rate, whereas industry sponsored clinical trials are conducted in a medical center. So there's just different funding streams for that space. But conversely, we can charge the entirety of someone's salary. So if someone's 10% effort on an industry sponsored clinical trial, we can charge the entirety of their salary, whereas NIH or other federal entities cap that amount. So there's all these trade-offs about different sponsors, their indirect cost rates, the limitations they put on how we spend money, that then contributes all to that 2% that we get back at the end.
And that was my question, was whether that 2% would be the same for industry and federal sponsors. That goes down to the division.
So we kind of look at it as one big pot of money because indirect costs don't come in separate chunks. It just comes down as in that funnel kind of approach. And it's an average. 2% is about an average. One of the things I always like to remind our investigators when they go around talking about all the indirect costs they bring in, is to remind them that things like training awards, career development awards have either no indirect costs associated with them, even though they're a federal award, or they have 8%. And so even when you look at the federal grants, you don't truly get the entire amount if you look at your entire book of business.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Any other questions or finance?
So is the only way for the department to get more money to be able to function to do a bake sale? Or to negotiate higher RVUs with the hospitals? And there doesn't look to be a whole lot of opportunity out there for new revenue generating opportunities for the department, which strikes me because as we're constantly growing and changing and developing things, where do those new funds, what tree can we pluck those from?
Well, I was actually thinking t-shirts.
Oh,
More
t-shirts.
lucrative than bake sales, but that's just me.
Let's put a bakery next to a pot shop and then we'll be, yeah.
It'll all be good. So just to be clear, RVUs are that's established. We don't establish those internally. We, as an institution, we can establish how much money we give to a department for that RVU, but the RVU itself is a nationally mandated or established rate. So yeah, I mean, I guess one option would be to see if it is viable to obtain a higher dollar per work RVU valuation for our work. That is certainly one. The other would be to suddenly have the state legislature allocate more money to the University of Washington. Not really thinking that's going to happen any day soon, but we can all keep that one in our thoughts and prayers.
And the likelihood of that getting down to us as opposed to being upper campus or other places is little.
Yeah, it's pretty low.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, pretty low.
Yeah, I mean, some people say you're getting, you know, everything that we increase comes with an increased cost as well.
Right.
So if we add more clinics, we add more clinical sites, then you also need more faculty and you also need more staff. So yeah, it's where's my spinning the plates picture that I like to show every time. It's a matter of keeping the plates spinning.
You can also try and bring in more commercial payers because you have probably a better chance of negotiating with those commercial payers a higher rate than you are with Medicare and Medicaid. So it's just, yeah, just bringing in different payers and just pumping out clinics. But yeah, as Monica said, that also adds, you know, your overhead costs and clinic time and staff salaries to pay. So
it's also where our mission focus
Right.
comes into play. So for instance, you know, I mentioned career development awards, fellowship awards, they don't come with full indirect cost rates. Private institutions can choose to just not handle those sorts of grants, you know, or not work with foundations who pay a low indirect cost rate. Whereas the University of Washington is pretty generous. And I think most academic medical centers are pretty generous about accepting all of these funding sources that have really low indirect cost rates associated with them, because we understand that that's how we keep our pipeline filled of people to stay in academia. So, you know, we pay a price for that, which is why every time somebody says they want to apply for a training grant, I kind of get this little heebie-jeebie because I know how much it actually costs us to run the training grant.
Monica, I have a question about the research cost recovery calculation for medicine. And I apologize too, I missed the first part of the presentation because I was on a meeting. So maybe you covered it, but does the RCR calculation vary by different schools and departments? So for example, do we get fewer indirects returned in medicine compared to like the College of Education?
Yeah, so each school/college gets to decide how they want to handle that. Just like, so the other day I was listening to a presentation from somebody from Stanford, which has an incredibly high indirect cost rate, right? And they get more of their RCR back to the department, but on the other hand, they have to turn around and pay rent for their lab space, like by the square foot. Whereas we don't do that. That's kind of handled in this loosey-goosey way. I don't think people in the School of Medicine would appreciate me calling it loosey-goosey, but essentially they pay our rent, which is why they take a bigger proportion of our indirect costs. Now, on the other hand, within the department, that gives us more ability to maybe leave somebody in a lab while they're having a little funding gap or they're trying to get started, because we're not looking at those people and calculating against them and saying, you cost me $83 per square foot, therefore I'm only going to give you this bench and you have to make it or break it. So there's all these sorts of different aspects of it.
Thanks. That's a really helpful illustration because sometimes we hear from faculty members that their peers at other institutions get a larger portion of their indirect costs back. And I've tried to think of new ways to kind of articulate how we use our indirect cost. So thanks for sharing that.
Sure. And I think it's important to note that even in other departments within our school, it's handled very, very differently. I don't think there's any divisions who do this any longer in the Department of Medicine, but a long, long time ago, I know of at least one division that would allocate back all these little funds to the PIs, but then our principal investigators, for those of you who don't work in research, and then, but then on the other hand, they were always like scrambling for money for their staff. And so I was kind of like, well, why don't you help yourself, kind of thing. So that does happen in other departments, even within our school. But again, those are typically basic science departments, and they get different educational allocations. And then they also impose educational, like teaching requirements on those faculty. So they might get some money, but then they also have to teach a quarter of grad school. So there's always a trade-off.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, any other questions out there? All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out today. We appreciate you sticking around and asking questions and learning what some of these terms mean, and hopefully we can continue to have this conversation. All right.
Thanks,
Go
Michelle
get
and
some
Melina.
sun. All right. Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
I think a bake sale is going to be the way to go.
Oh, wait, where's Zarina? She's the one who bakes all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Right? When we